At 6, a Conservative mayor accuses the government of cancelling the future if the HS2 high-speed rail line between Birmingham and Manchester isn't built.
Go on, cancel Euston, cancel to Manchester, but you will be turning your back on an opportunity to level up, a once-in-a-generation opportunity.
Andy Street's intervention in the last half hour electrifies this debate. You know, it's been nearly 3 weeks now of the government refusing to answer questions about whether it'll push ahead with cancelling HS2 or allowing it to be built.
Also tonight, water companies want to charge customers more money to help pay for repairs. A breakthrough in the fight against malaria, the new vaccine that could save the lives of hundreds of thousands of children in Africa. The former boss of the fashion brand Abercrombie & Fitch faces claims of exploitation by men recruited to have sex at events he hosted, finds a BBC investigation. And why thousands of oysters have been released into the sea off the north coast of England.
On BBC London, another teenage knife crime victim in London. A 16-year-old is stabbed to death in Enfield, the 16th life lost to youth homicide this year.
Good evening. The row over HS2 has intensified this evening. The Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, has urged the Prime Minister not to give up on the high-speed rail line between Birmingham and Manchester. It comes amid speculation that Rishi Sunak is about to announce that stage of the project will be axed. Andy Street says the government must not give up on HS2, but that the Prime Minister is right to try and get a grip of the situation. With the latest, here's our political editor, Chris Mason, in Manchester.
Sophie, party conferences are cauldrons of gossip and whispers, denials and announcements. And the whole question of HS2, whether it'll be built in full between Birmingham and Manchester, as well as the connection between the West Midlands and London, has dominated over the last couple of days here for a simple reason. The government won't answer that very simple question. The speculation has swirled again today. Tonight, Downing Street say that no final decision has yet been made. And yet that intervention from the Mayor of the West Midlands once again sparking up the discussion. That's the first reason why the Chancellor of the Exchequer's speech today was overshadowed. There was a second reason, quite a bit of drama at lunchtime. Monday morning in Manchester, and a high-profile visitor. Well, who should be turning up? The former Prime Minister.
Are you just here to cause trouble?
This time last year, Liz Truss was in charge, and now she's back. Yes. Activists queued around the building, up and down staircases. More than 100 couldn't get into the packed room, but some familiar faces did. Liz Truss's message was familiar too: cutting corporation tax, reducing energy bills, and building more houses.
Let's be prepared to make Conservative arguments again, even if it's unpopular, even if it's difficult. I want everybody in this room to unleash their inner Conservative. And finally, my friends, let's make Britain grow again. Thank you.
A slogan borrowed and amended from Donald Trump. Remember, Conservative activists voted to make Liz Truss Prime Minister, and some are still angry Tory MPs brought her down.
Meeting some members at the moment.
She didn't want to answer questions today, but she did pose for pictures and even sign a copy of her mini budget, which prompted economic calamity and political disaster for her. What prompts all this? The government and Labour are increasingly similar, reckons the former leader of the Brexit Party.
We're all here looking for big differences. There aren't really. What was being talked about today, effectively, was to reset the Conservative Party after they lose next year.
Maybe I should whisper this, but how much is this about a party contemplating defeat and thinking about what comes next?
What was it Queen Victoria said? She said the possibility of defeat does not exist.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt.
From the fringe to the main stage, Jeremy Hunt said he'll put up the national living wage to at least £11 an hour from next April.
That's a pay rise for 2 million workers. and the wages of the lowest paid over £9,000 higher than they were in 2010. Because if you work hard, a Conservative government will always have your back.
But yet again today, the question that's been unanswered for nearly 3 weeks: will there be a new high-speed rail line between Manchester and Birmingham? Plenty here think the Prime Minister's about to scrap it. Number 10 insist no final decision has been taken.
People here have waited far too long for a functional railway, and we are not going to sell our own residents down the river and make them wait even longer.
Gripping this situation means re-examining it. It does not mean giving up, admitting defeat, you could say, or even, you could say, cancelling the future.
Mr. Street, have you considered resigning over the cancellation of the Northern leg of HS2?
We're not talking about that. The issue is we're working hard on finding the solution for the Prime Minister.
Over to you, Prime Minister, to say what you want to do. And you saw there a duo of mayors. One Labour, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, one Conservative, Andy Street, speaking to us around about 5:30 this afternoon. Mr. Street pleading in public for the maintenance of the transport infrastructure around the West Midlands that he has long called for, forced to plead in public with a Prime Minister a handful of floors above him in his prime ministerial suite in his hotel here in Manchester, still refusing to answer that central question. And as I say, the line from number 10 tonight is that no final decision has yet been made, and hence the airwaves are full of concern from the likes of Mr. Burnham and Mr. Street until that decision is formally announced. What we can hazard a very strong guess at, a very educated guess at, is that HS2 as originally planned between London and Manchester ain't going to be what Mr. Sunak wants to see. But he still hasn't said that explicitly, nor what he wants to do instead.
Chris Mason, our political editor, thank you. Water companies in England and Wales have announced they want to increase customers' bills to pay for upgrades and reduce sewer discharges. They say the increase would allow spending on infrastructure to almost double to £96 billion. The average annual bill would go up by £84 in 2025 if the regulator Ofwat approves the plans, and it would mean £156 more on bills by 2030. But critics say water companies have failed to invest adequately since they were privatised more than 30 years ago. Our environment correspondent Jonah Fisher reports.
We will run out of water, not within the next 50 years, but within the next 5 to 10 if we do nothing.
Our water infrastructure has been starved of investment for decades. And in East Anglia, making sure it keeps flowing for everyone is a recurring headache.
Climate change is the biggest challenge we face as a company.
Big problems need huge, expensive solutions.
Try putting that plate down the back, yeah?
This pipe transporting water from wet to dry areas will cost £500 million.
It's taking water from North Lincolnshire, where we know we have more rain, bringing it down to Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, where we have a lot less.
Today the water companies have submitted to the regulator Ofwat their wish lists, what they want to spend between 2025 and 2030. And it's a huge number, nearly £100 billion. That's almost twice as much as in the previous 5-year period. And the cost of all that is ultimately going to fall on customers. It's estimated that by 2030, bills will rise on average by about £156. If approved by the regulator, the plans would see 10 new reservoirs built, leaks from pipes reduced, and £11 billion spent to tackle raw sewage spills.
It's got into a dreadful state.
Peter says this chalk stream in King's Lynn used to be crystal clear. But he says the cost of cleaning it up shouldn't fall on bill payers.
I'm not personally inclined to pay any more. They've had tens of billions of pounds of our money over the last 30 years since they were privatised. So I suggest that they start getting some money back from their Australian pension funds and their other investors that they've paid out enormous dividends to before they start asking customers to pay more.
Do you accept that water companies have in the past got it wrong, that profit has been put ahead of stopping pollution?
I think that water companies have got work to do on building trust with customers again, but hopefully seeing schemes like this today show that we have the environment and looking after our customers at the heart of what we do.
A final decision on which projects go ahead and how much bills will rise will be taken late next year. Jonah Fisher, BBC News.
Thames Valley Police has confirmed it's investigating harassment and stalking allegations made by a woman against the comedian and actor Russell Brand. The BBC has approached Mr Brand for a response to these allegations. It comes after the Metropolitan Police confirmed it had received a number of allegations of sexual offences after a joint investigation by the Sunday Times, The Times and Channel 4's Dispatches, in which 4 women accused Mr Brand of sexual assaults and rape. Russell Brand has denied those claims. A murder investigation has been launched in Yorkshire after a triple stabbing in Halifax in the early hours of Sunday morning. A 21-year-old died in hospital. West Yorkshire Police say a 19-year-old also died last night. 3 men, 2 aged 18 and 1 aged 19, have been arrested. Junior doctors and consultants have walked out together in England for their longest ever joint strike. NHS bosses have warned of extreme disruption in hospitals until Thursday morning. The government says that this year's pay rise of 6% for consultants and just under 9% for junior doctors was a final and fair deal, but their union, the British Medical Association, says it's not enough. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson is at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in South London for us now. Sophie.
Well, Sophie, in years gone by, it would have been almost unimaginable for junior and senior doctors to walk out of hospitals in protest, let alone together and for 3 days. But that is where we are, with only emergency care being provided. This is the 28th day that NHS England has seen hospitals have walkouts by doctors. The dispute is over pay. The government says that doctors have had a fair pay deal this year. They've seen for consultants an increase of 6% and for junior doctors on average an increase of nearly 9%. But doctors say they want above inflation pay increases, and their strike, one of the biggest that we've seen so far on the week of the Tory party conference, is no doubt intended to send a strong message to ministers that they are not afraid to continue striking if they don't get the pay offer that they wish for. The impact on patients, of course, has been very clear. In the past 10 months, more than 1 million appointments have been cancelled in the NHS in England due to strikes by NHS staff. And that figure will certainly only grow with this week's strike. NHS England is saying that routine care will be grind to almost a halt. And as this dispute escalates in England, there is a real risk that it could also escalate in other parts of the United Kingdom. In Wales and in Northern Ireland, doctors, both junior and consultants, are being balloted for strike action.
Sophie, thank you. The Nobel Prize for Medicine has been awarded to 2 scientists who developed the technology that led to the mRNA COVID vaccines. Dr. Caitlin Carrico from Hungary and Dr. Drew Weissman from the United States will share the prize. The technology was experimental before the pandemic, but has now been used for millions of jabs around the world. It's being billed as a breakthrough that could save millions of lives. A new vaccine for malaria developed by Oxford University has been recommended by the World Health Organization. The disease claims hundreds of thousands of lives every year, mostly children in Africa. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, is here with all the details. Fergus.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, malaria has been causing untold human suffering for millennia. The parasitic infection is spread by mosquitoes. Africa is worst affected, particularly the areas marked in red here, which account for 95% of the global burden of malaria. In 2021, there were an estimated 234 million cases and 593,000 deaths from malaria in Africa, Most of those were children under the age of 5. The Oxford vaccine is called R21 and requires children to have 4 doses. Trials run by Oxford's Jenner Institute show it's around 75% effective at preventing malaria. Crucially, the world's biggest vaccine manufacturer, the Serum Institute in India, has agreed to produce 100 million doses a year of the Oxford jab at between $2 and $4 a dose. And this will be Africa's second malaria vaccine. The first, RTSS, from pharma giant GSK, costs about twice as much. Since 2019, just 1.7 million jabs have been administered. So the new Oxford vaccine could be delivered at a much bigger scale.
Today is a great day for health, a great day for science, and a great day for vaccines. As a malaria researcher, I used to dream of the day when we would have a safe and effective vaccine against malaria. Now we have 2.
Well, today's announcement follows a major trial of the Oxford malaria vaccine involving nearly 5,000 children across 4 African countries, lasting several years. Our correspondent Anne Soy witnessed some of the children getting booster doses in Tanzania and has this report.
A life-saving jab, giving protection against one of the biggest killers of African children, malaria. It has taken decades to find. 3-year-old Hajra was one of hundreds of volunteers in the clinical trials. Her mother, 39-year-old Mwazani Saif, had a compelling reason to enroll the youngest of her 6 children in the study.
I lost my nephew. He was only 4 when he died from malaria. That's why when I heard that there was a malaria vaccine trial, I said I wanted to participate because it will help us.
Here in Bagamoyo, 600 children took part in the trial. Experts are urging people to continue using the proven methods of preventing infection, even with the discovery of a new vaccine. The results of the final phase of the research surpassed expectations.
What we've shown in 1 year after the 3 doses, the efficacy is about 75%. Again, well above the goal set by the WHO and malaria community, and this is really exciting.
The job is far from done. The vaccine now needs to be delivered to villages and towns across Africa. For families like Mwanzani's, it will bring them much-needed relief from disease and keep her children alive. Anne Soy, BBC News, Bagamoyo.
The time is coming up to 6:20, our top story this evening. The Conservative Mayor for the West Midlands accuses the government of cancelling the future if the HS2 high-speed rail line between Birmingham and Manchester isn't built. And coming up, Donald Trump appears in court in a civil trial for financial fraud.
And on BBC London, the family of a young boy whose toes were ripped off in an escalator at London Bridge launched legal action. And Enfield welcomes a baby beaver, the first to be born in London in 400 years.
The former chief executive of the global fashion brand Abercrombie & Fitch and his British partner are facing allegations of exploitation from men recruited for sex events they hosted around the world. A BBC investigation found a highly organised operation running the events, with a middleman finding young adult men for Mike Jeffries and his partner Matthew Smith. 8 men told the BBC they attended these events, some of whom alleged they were exploited or abused. Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Smith did not respond to requests for comment. Rhianna Croxford has the story.
In the early 2000s, Abercrombie & Fitch became one of the hottest labels in the US and around the world. Sexualised imagery and provocative billboards turned the teen retailer, which also owns the Hollister brand, into a multi-billion-dollar sensation. The man behind the vision was then CEO Mike Jeffries.
Mike was tireless. He was very energetic and boisterous. He was an incredibly big personality. He would explode into a room.
BBC Panorama has uncovered a highly organised international operation recruiting young adult men for sex with Mike Jeffries over several years when he was the CEO of the brand.
This experience, I think it broke me, and it mentally messed me up.
2 men have agreed to tell me their accounts on camera. They attended separate events hosted by Mike Jeffries in 2010 and 2011. Both men say they were recruited and auditioned by a middleman, James Jacobson, known to the men as Jim. David says Mr. Jacobson led him to believe he was pursuing a modelling opportunity.
Take 1. I was made to believe, look, this is where everybody gets their start. This is where you want to get your start. It was like he was selling fame. And the price was compliance.
David says compliance meant engaging in a sexual act with Mr. Jacobson. 7 more men I've spoken to say they also met with Jim. The men say Mr. Jacobson was part of a well-oiled machine, which included recruiters, drivers and other staff. Mr. Jacobson told the BBC any encounters were fully consensual, not coercive. He said he had no recollection of making promises of modelling opportunities and that everyone who he came into contact with who attended these events went in with their eyes wide open.
But yeah, this is the route that the men would have taken on their way to the Hamptons when they were going to go and meet with Mike Jeffries.
Once through the audition, the men would then go to an event hosted by Mr. Jeffries and his British partner, Matthew Smith. Some were held at their home here in the exclusive New York coastal community, the Hamptons. Barrett said he was introduced to Mr. Jacobson by an older model who he felt indebted to and knew there would be some kind of sexual activity. David says he was not expecting sex to take place at the Hamptons.
I was taken, chaperoned over to the main house, to the doors that entered into the bedroom where everything was happening, and then told to disrobe.
Barrett says he engaged in an intimate act with another man. David says Mr. Jeffries had sex with him.
I didn't feel safe to say no, or I don't feel comfortable with this. I don't really know what would have happened. I didn't feel like I had any choice.
Both men say they felt leaving didn't seem to be an option because Mr. Jeffries' private staff were supervising the event, including in the bedroom. They also say they were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements beforehand and were not given any copies to take away.
I feel like they were trying to scare us. That's what it felt like. It felt like intimidation.
Both men were paid around $2,500 after the events they attended. Still hoping it may lead to modelling work, David went to further events with Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Smith, both in the US and around the world. 2 US lawyers who reviewed evidence uncovered by the BBC said prosecutors should investigate whether the allegations could amount to sex trafficking. The BBC has made repeated attempts to contact Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Smith. They have not responded. Abercrombie & Fitch told us it is appalled and disgusted by the allegations about their former CEO's behaviour. It said a new executive leadership team has transformed the company's brand and culture, adding the company has zero tolerance for abuse, harassment or discrimination of any kind. Rhianna Croxford, BBC News.
And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in that report, you can find more details of support online at bbc.co.uk/action line. And just to say, you can watch Panoramas The Abercrombie Guys, The Dark Side of Cool at 9 p.m. on BBC One and now on BBC iPlayer. And you can also listen to the podcast series World of Secrets Season 1, The Abercrombie Guys on BBC Sounds. The boss of the John Lewis partnership, Dame Sharon White, is to step down next year after 5 years, making her the shortest-serving chair in the organisation's 100-year history. The business, which includes the department stores and Waitrose supermarkets, reported a loss of more than £200 million last year, forcing it to scrap the annual staff bonus. The price of a first-class stamp has risen for the 3rd time in 18 months. It will now cost £1.25, an increase of 15 pence. Second-class stamps will remain at 75p. Royal Mail has blamed increasing cost pressures and the tough economic environment for the latest price rise. Donald Trump has appeared in court in New York at the start of a civil fraud trial which could have serious consequences for his business interests. The former president denounced the trial as a scam and a sham as he arrived at court. New York's Attorney General is suing Mr. Trump and two of his sons after a judge ruled that they vastly inflated the value of their properties and other assets. Our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue reports now from New York.
Donald Trump in court yet again. The question this time around, is he as rich as he says he is?
Yeah, it's a scam, it's a sham. Just so you know, my financial statements are phenomenal.
He's being sued by the New York Attorney General, who says he spent a decade overinflating the value of his properties in order to secure loans, insurance and lower interest rates. She's after $250 million in fines and damages.
No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law. And it is my responsibility and my duty and my job to enforce it.
Donald Trump's accused of overstating the value of his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida by 25 times. He exaggerated the size of his penthouse apartment in Trump Tower by 200%. And overall, he may have claimed to be $2 billion richer than he really is. Before the trial began, the judge had already found Donald Trump and his two sons liable for fraudulently inflating the value of their properties. So these proceedings are to determine just how big the fines will be. This is a civil case, so they won't go to jail, but they could end up a lot poorer. This is one of Donald Trump's prized possessions, 40 Wall Street, at the heart of New York's financial district. When he bought it, he said it was the greatest property deal in history. If he loses this case, he could have it taken away from him, and with it a whole chunk of his self-proclaimed reputation as a property genius. Gary O'Donoghue, BBC News, New York.
The former Manchester City and England striker Francis Lee has died at the age of 79. He scored 148 goals during an 8-year spell at City. He was also part of the 1970 World Cup squad. He will be remembered as one of Manchester City's all-time greats. Now, for hundreds of years, oysters were in plentiful supply around the UK's coast, and they were cheap, so cheap that in the 1800s, oysters were known as the poor man's food, sold on many street corners. But overfishing and pollution meant that by the 1900s, they'd been all but wiped out, turning them into an expensive delicacy. Now, thousands are being released onto a man-made reef off the northeast coast of England to try to boost their numbers. Fiona Trott reports.
To the North Sea. Off the coast of Sunderland, a final batch of oysters, 10,000 oysters, are thrown into the water. Their aim, to reverse centuries of disease and exploitation.
So native oysters once used to be a common sight around the UK coastlines. We've actually seen a 95% decline of the native oyster from our UK seas, and with that loss, you also lose the ecosystem service benefits that oysters provide. So our project is geared towards restoring oysters and also restoring the benefit that they can have to our oceans.
Over the past week, they've been building a reef the size of a football pitch. Day after day, 750 tonnes of stones and shells have been brought out to sea, a new home for the oysters to cling on to.
Oysters are clever things. They can filter around 200 litres of dirty water a day, suck up the pollutants and then deposit them on the seabed. That's exactly what 10,000 of these are doing right now out at sea.
And around 100 local volunteers have helped make it happen.
Why are you doing this personally?
Personally, I'm doing this because it feels like I'm helping, personally helping, and it's giving something back to the community.
These are challenging times for our seas, but the hope is this. If the project here is successful, it's not only the native oyster that will benefit, it's other species like cod and crab, which are a lifeline for the local economy too. Fiona Trott, BBC News, Sunderland.
Time now for a look at the weather. Helen Willits is here. Hello.
Hello. It's been a warm September. We know that.
figures are in now. It's been joint record breaking, but this is the one I think is most significant. The warmest by day since 1895, and that was because of the heat wave, of course, we had earlier in the month. And of course, October started on the same note. One of the warmest October days for about 5 years yesterday, but that heat and humidity has triggered all these thunderstorms that we've got at the moment for those travelling, as well as the heavy rain on that weather front further north. So for England and Wales, some fairly nasty conditions if you're travelling with those thunderstorms, torrential downpours, spray and standing water. But behind it, it should clear away. A much fresher night. We hang on to the humidity for one more night in southern and eastern areas. But I'm hopeful most of those showers will have cleared by the morning, as will the frontal cloud. Well, it's been misty and murky over the hills. And a much brighter and a much fresher day for all tomorrow, notably in the south. We'll really notice that sunny spells, scattered showers, a brisker breeze, so those showers will whisk through. And certainly most prevalent, as you'd see in this situation, in northern and western areas. But the temperatures are several degrees down temporarily. We'll come back to that at the end of the forecast, because high pressure is starting to build then later tomorrow and into Wednesday in the south. But these weather fronts are still coming into the north and the west, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So there are some weather warnings for rain out for later in the week, because we will see several pulses on these weather systems running in, but not further south, looking mostly dry and fine, just about 18s and 19s on Wednesday, still warm even with the rain further north. It's later in the week where things start to really warm up. More rain Thursday, Friday, particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland, but even here, by the time we get to the weekend, low 20s, mid-20s, potentially 25, 26 further south and east. Sophie.
Wow. Helen, thank you. And that's it from the BBC News at 6. You can, of course, keep up to date with all the latest developments on the BBC website. But right now it's time for the news where you are. Goodbye.